And welcome to today's meeting of the Fire, Resilience and Emergency Planning Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag AssemblyFire for this meeting. Please may I remind participants to turn off your phones or put them on silent. The main item on the agenda today is a question and answer session with the London Fire Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. However, we have some short items of business first. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chairman. No apologies for absence have been received.
Thank you. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on the agenda? No, I'll take that as a no. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting of the 3rd of February 2021 and 27th of May 2021? Agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the completed ongoing and closed actions arising from the previous meetings of the committee and the additional correspondence sent and received as listed in the report? Agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can we note the recent action taken from the former chair of the committee under delegated authority following consultation with party group lead members to agree the committee's cladding recommendations report? Thank you. Can we note the Mayor's response to the cladding crisis report and to the follow-up cladding recommendations report? Good, thank you. Now that brings us to our main item of business, a question and answer session with the London Fire Commissioner and the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience. So can I welcome our guests and thank them for joining us today. That's Dr. Fiona Twycross. Welcome, Fiona. And Andy Rowe, who is on our screens as if by magic or not. He will appear on our screens, I'm sure, at some point.
Good morning, Susan.
Good morning. And supporting the Commissioner from the London Fire Brigade, Paul Jennings, who is Assistant Commissioner for the London Fire Brigade, and Fiona Dolman, Director for Transformation, also of the Fire Brigade. Okay, so I'm going to ask some questions, but actually, Andy, if I may ask you a couple of questions first before we start on the Elephant and Castle incident. Given risk information post-Grenfell, it's key that crews use the MDT, the mobile data terminal, to gather risk information on the premises. Given that it was reported to be workshops, the first appliance was parked directly outside the premises and a firefighter can be seen moving away from the heat. It also looks like there was burning material running towards the fire engine. Can you actually comment on that for me?
Yeah. So thank you, Chair. And just before I answer, just to recognise that we're really pleased to welcome so many new committee members and obviously yourself as the new chair of the committee. It's a real privilege to sit in front of you and face your questions. Appliance sighting is very important in the context of safety, as is our immediate response, particularly to an incident like this where it's clear there was a fairly dynamic fire and explosion at the very beginning of what was then a complex incident to resolve. I can't give you the details of what we found post-incident because we're still working through the incident debrief process, but I would be happy to write to you, Chair, with details of the learning that we've gathered from the incident, because a series of debriefs have either occurred already or are in place to unpick that learning.
No, I'm not asking you for that. I'm asking, was a recce done of it prior to this?
That's something we would unpick in the debrief process. So one of the standard questions would be, did you use the MDT? Did you know what the risk information was on the premise? Was there an appropriate record? Was it appropriate that there would be a record for it? So those are standard questions that we would ask as part of the post-operational debrief process, and I would be happy to write to you, Chair, to provide that information.
Yes, if you could write to the committee, I'd be grateful. And just your comment on how near to that the fire tender was. Are you happy with that?
In terms of appliance sighting,
fire engine
again,
was
I think
very
it would be
near
wrong to prejudge the outcome of what is an independently chaired debrief process post-incident. But it is certainly a serious question and one that we would want considered within that.
Okay, I'd be very happy to have your findings as soon as they're there, please, because this has been highlighted to me as an issue. So that's what this committee is here for, to keep an eye on these things. So we're going now into questions on cladding. So really, I could start with you, Fiona, if you like, and then we'll talk to Andy. Does the London Fire Brigade have the resources it needs to deal with the cladding crisis in London? And what impact is the additional work undertaken by the Brigade as a result of the cladding crisis? What impact is it having on the Brigade's other work?
I think that it's part of that will be a question for the Commissioner, and I'd like to echo his words in terms of welcoming the opportunity to work with this committee and congratulate members on their election or re-election, and you, Chair, to your position as Chair of this committee. I think that the main issue for us in terms of cladding and other remediation that's required on the built environment in London is that it is taking too long, and it's putting strain on leaseholders in particular, where they are having to pay for remediation of their homes. So I think I'm confident that the Commissioner has got measures in place to address issues as they arise, but the key challenge really is the length of time the remediation process is taking. And I think I've been in meetings where it's been described as a 20-year process, and I think that we need to make sure that the unacceptable position with buildings having combustible cladding on is dealt with both quickly, but that we have a complete ban on combustible cladding going forward. So I think that I'm going to flip your question and say, actually, it means that we need to retain some of the measures that the Brigade has put in place, which Andy Rowe, the Commissioner, and Paul Jennings can speak to, around the higher level of predetermined attendance at high rise and some of the other measures. And I think Andy will speak to the new high rise policy, for example, which is part of the way that the Brigade is looking at how they can work in the context of the current built environment. But the bottom line on the built environment is that remediation needs to take place quicker, that residents need to not pay the price for shoddy workmanship or inappropriate construction in the first place, and that we need to make sure that the built environment, London, is as safe as it should be, so that everyone can move on and we can have the houses, the homes and the high rise that Londoners deserve.
Well, yes, and it must be very, very worrying if you're living in a building that you're not sure if it's safe or not. They certainly can't wait years and years. It's not fair to any of them. Andy, I just want brief answers, if you would. I know you love telling us all about it because it's very interesting, but we really need brief answers for you. How many buildings in London, Andy, still have unsafe cladding?
So we've got 901 buildings on Waking Watch, and that continues to grow. That's significant. That's twice the totality of all the high-rises in completeness in Manchester, just to give you a comparator. 675 of those 901 are due to cladding and non-ACM cladding issues. So that is the number within the 901 that are directly related to cladding issues. The remainder are as a result of other fire safety issues, such as compartmentation or fixed installations not working correctly.
Okay. How many times do your crews visit these properties that we're concerned aren't safe?
Paul, perhaps you could answer that, because I know that we've changed the way we approach the kind of management of Waking Watch, and perhaps you could give the Chair some detail on that.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Chair, for the invite today. Yes, we visit those on a fortnightly basis, but we also are carrying out premises risk assessments regularly at those buildings to update what we know, and also our fire safety inspecting officers are carrying out audits every 6 months on those premises. So we're getting a range of fire safety and fire station staff visiting those premises because they've got simultaneous evacuation strategies in place. That's
right. I mean, I've read that. So we are still definitely visiting those buildings every 2 weeks.
Yes, we are.
Good. I'm glad that's on date and on time. Fiona, what action will the Mayor take over the coming months to support Londoners affected by the cladding crisis?
So I think that the position at the moment is unacceptable, where people who've bought flats in good faith are having to pay for remediation of their buildings or for interim fire safety measures such as Waking Watch. And I think the government has said it is providing support to leaseholders, but my view and the Mayor's view is that they're not going far enough. So the Mayor has called on government to introduce a levy on major private developers that could raise £3 billion to fund the work required. And I think we need to have upfront government funding to cover the cost of remediating buildings of all heights. And I think one of the things that we need to avoid is assuming that it's just those high-rise that have got defects, and all types of safety defect, not just the cladding and interim fire safety measures need to be addressed and funded. I think people bought these properties in good faith or renting the properties in good faith and are finding that they're not able to move. And I think we do need a funding solution which government should lead on in order to make sure that people are able to basically have safe homes without carrying the costs themselves. And the levy on private developers would feel like an appropriate way to do that.
I mean, I can see the Mayor's written lots of letters, but has he done anything other than write letters? Has he dipped very much into his own funds for any of the London properties that require assistance?
So from the GLA perspective, the Housing and Land team deal with a lot of the remediation programmes. So we host those programmes at the GLA. I think this is about sort of looking at what the role of the GLA should be in this instance, and I'd suggest that a future meeting might have my colleague Deputy Mayor Tom Copley, who leads on a lot of this work, who can talk through the specifics about what is being done by the GLA and the Mayor.
Well, that would be helpful. I'm sure my colleagues would be pleased to have that. Zach, did you want to intervene?
Could I ask a supplementary on this question?
Yeah, if you...
Thank you. So my question's for the Deputy Mayor, and it's specifically about shared ownership, because we know that many people who have bought shared ownership are in trouble because the housing association won't buy it back. They're expected to pay 100% of the remediation costs, even though they don't own 100% of the home. So my question is very specifically about those shared ownership properties, about what specific action you'll take to protect those people who are caught in shared ownership.
I'm going to use the can I write to you about that? This isn't the area that I cover. I am involved in discussions on housing safety, but I can get an answer for you on that from my colleague Tom Copley and from Housing and Land, because I agree that that would seem to be a specific issue that does need to be addressed.
Back to you, Andy. What direct impact are Waking Watches having on the Brigade?
So in simple terms, it's an increase in the activity we use crews for. So if you look at the number, we're looking at 901 of those buildings in London now, and that number is going up. So obviously it is a draw on our resources. However, the work is that fundamentally important. I see it as something we have to maintain continuously into the future until those buildings are remediated. That is the simple answer, Chair.
Okay. Do you give assistance? Because I believe some buildings don't have to have a Waking Watch if they have an appropriate main alarm system. So do you give assistance to the owners of the buildings or the leaseholders on getting proper alarm systems put in so they won't be paying for Waking Watches?
Yeah, so we are really interested in working with responsible persons to put in the appropriate mitigation. Paul perhaps would be better placed to answer the detail of that, because he has responsibility for providing the regulatory advice to those responsible persons. Paul, could you perhaps give a sense of where we are with that to the Chair?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, we work with the NFCC, who've drafted the simultaneous evacuation guide, and within that there's lots of guidance for responsible persons and information for leaseholders around the benefits of getting a common alarm fitted, which will negate ongoing costs, but also has the potential to be converted once the building's been remediated to an evacuation system, which would help us in the future should there be a need for the fire service to evacuate any persons in that building.
Certainly looks the way forward. Zach, can you wait to the end of the questions and you can put them all in at once after the others. Fiona, how has the GLA supported people through the application processes for the Waking Watch Relief
Susan,
Fund?
could I just ask something about the evacuations that we were just touching on?
I've got so many people coming in afterwards. Do you want to come back to it? Let me get through the main questions and then we can cut it. We're all on the same. If not, we'll all be
I think
going.
we're going to kind of repeat ourselves a lot.
Yeah,
anyway.
it'll be
Okay.
fine. Sorry, Fiona, how has the GLA supported people through the application processes for the Waking Watch Relief Fund? And do you think people have received the right level of support? And what is the process for those who have been declined support through the scheme?
This isn't something that I've been directly responsible for. I can get a response on that in writing to the committee. And apologies, Chair, that this isn't the area that my brief covers specifically. So I don't want to give you a half answer or an incorrect answer. I'd rather come back with the details.
That's fair
Thank
enough.
you.
We'll write to
Yeah.
who, in your opinion, is the right Deputy Mayor to write to
Tom Copley.
for the Waking Watches?
For the process of the remediation as administered by the GLA, yes.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
I think this is such an important
No, absolutely,
subject.
and I'm not dismissing.
No, I
I'm
know
not
you're
dismissing
not.
the subject. But
My
yeah,
point is,
thanks.
it's such an
Yeah,
important subject.
absolutely.
I think we'll be coming to this at a longer session. It's just that because it's so important, we wanted to cover it in this meeting today. Back to Andy, are you being informed of the buildings in London applying for the loan schemes that would ensure that no leaseholder will pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding?
Paul, could you provide detail to the Chair how we're working with the GLA's housing team to share appropriate information, please?
Okay,
Yes,
we'll
I-
definitely have to get housing here. Do you want to answer the best you can?
I will. We've set up a high-risk premises team that coordinate all the information flow around premises in London with simultaneous evacuation, and we're sharing that information in a two-way process with the housing team here in the GLA.
Okay, and is that the same with the, excuse me, Mayor's Task and Finish group examining the EWS ones? The forms that have to be filled in to say it's a safe building, is that down to housing as well?
It is, yeah. It'd be housing
Okay,
land.
right, okay, I'll leave my questioning at that point. The first person that's indicated to me that they want questions on various parts of this is Hina.
Thank you, Chair. I am going to ask a question that I think you're probably familiar with already, that I'm concerned about, is that a lot of people who've applied for the Building Safety Fund and the Waking Watch Relief have been waiting for many months, and many of those Londoners are in limbo. And I know that you said that this is something you might write back about, but could you give me some indication of at least perhaps looking at to how we can communicate with these applicants, whilst the GLA is processing their funding applications, to make sure that they are regularly updated. And I do realise that there is a delay because of the MHCLG, but what is the GLA doing about it?
I think I know that you've had a couple of meetings with Tom Copley. I suggest that we set something up where you can talk through this direct, or if the Chair would prefer, we can get something in writing about that. This is a process that's managed by the Housing and Land team. And apologies again, Chair, I'm absolutely not trying to avoid the answers.
I know you'd answer if you
Yeah.
could.
Thank
Do
you.
you have a couple of questions about Waking Watch, though, that can be directed to the London Fire Brigade? if
Yes,
that's okay?
certainly. Yep.
To the Commissioner, how are the London Fire Brigade working with housing associations specifically and City Hall to ensure that Waking Watches are actually being operated effectively and actually where they're really needed?
So for me, it's not a question of working necessarily with housing associations. I view all responsible persons in the same context. They have a responsibility for the safety of their residents. The way we ensure that those residents are as safe as they can possibly be in what is an unsatisfactorily regulated built environment at this point in time is through good, competent inspection by our frontline crews, so the 2 weekly rotation of wake and watch inspection that my colleague has already referred to, and specific advice where relevant from our regulatory fire safety officers. So it's that direct interaction between fire safety specialists and our frontline crews going back repeatedly to ensure that what responsible persons say they have in place is actually in place.
And do you think that the London Fire Brigade would consider actually making some plans of perhaps helping us by getting an approved list of companies of waking watches, just so that there's some assurances that they are reputable, as it would give Londoners assurances that the companies are above board?
I'm afraid, and I need to be really clear about this, is that the responsibility for those provisions, whilst we will come and assure ourselves that they're suitable, is the responsibility of the people who own and manage the buildings, and it would not be appropriate in a legal context for us to engage in that way to produce a list of what we think are approved contractors. It is entirely the legal responsibility of the responsible persons.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Cooper.
Thanks very much, Chair. I wanted to come back to the issue of the simultaneous evacuation orders, and this might be one for Andy or it might be one for Paul. And I just wondered, and we know that there's a lot of these orders in place, and how many of them are in place due to unsafe cladding, or are there other fire safety defects? Because I think we know that there's now been, we ourselves in the Assembly did a report in 2009 on the, I think it came out in 2013 on the Larkanel House fire, and I think we know that other issues have arisen to do with compartmentalisation. So I just wondered how many of the evacuation orders are in place in relation to other issues and not so much to do with cladding.
So looking at my figures, we've got 675 out of the 901 that have simultaneous evacuation in place due to ATM and non-ATM cladding issues, which leaves the remainder, which is therefore, I'm just doing quick maths, so it's 226 buildings on that list currently are there because of other fire safety defects, which will include everything from lack of compartmentation to poor management to the fact that fixed installations aren't working. So those things like fire doors, dry risers, the things that enable us to operate safely in a building aren't maintained to the right standard, for example. So that'll be a host of fire safety defects contained within that number.
So being able to access the Building Safety Fund for a wide range of defects is obviously important in terms of dealing with the people who've often now got the waking watch and the simultaneous evacuation orders applied to the buildings that they're in. And I just wondered, in terms of applying to the Waking Watch Relief Fund and the process, has that process been set out by the government, and how well is it going, and has the GLA been able to provide any feedback to the government to improve that? And I'm thinking actually that might be something that Fiona can help us with. Good morning.
Hi. Can you repeat the sort of final bit of the question? Sorry.
Yeah, it's to do with the fund for the Waking Watch Relief Fund, and I assume that the process for that, applying to it, has been set by the government. How well is it going, and has the GLA been able to give any feedback, possibly from either from your office, your team, or from the fire brigade in any way to improve the processes?
This process isn't managed by the fire team. I think another time I maybe need to come and do a double act with Tom Copley if you're wanting to cover cladding, because I think I don't feel that I'm able to respond to the questions of the committee effectively. So I think we can get you a proper briefing on this, Chair, and apologies again. I will bring Tom with me next time.
So can I just follow up, Chair, just to see, would that also be the case on the loan scheme for buildings under 18 metres in height, which was announced about 5 months ago? Has the details of that been shared with the Mayor? And again, is that something that Housing and Land is going to be dealing with?
I think you would have to have a conversation with Tom about this.
It's another Tom issue.
Thank you.
We will definitely have another session with Tom and the brigade. Have you asked or that you're going to ask?
Well, I mean, that's quite a lot of money. I mean, my understanding is the loan scheme is going to be about £3.5 billion. So I think it's quite important that perhaps this committee sooner rather than later, because obviously I completely appreciate that the Deputy Mayor for Fire can't really step into the shoes of the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Land. So,
No, I agree. And I think the government's given billions to it. So we need to have a look and see how much of it's coming to London.
because so much of it applies to London, I think Andy's headline figure was 901.
And a high proportion of it is coming here. So we need to look at that. You're quite right. Assembly Member Polanski.
Very much. I also had questions about EWS one forms and loans, but I won't ask them because I can hear that we need the Deputy Mayor for Housing. So just one question for the Deputy Mayor then. So I've been talking to the Endell Cladding scandal campaigners, and I think they wrote to you but didn't seem to receive a reply on this, that we now have 901 buildings on Waking Watch.
Yeah.
What is the process for deciding if a building is Waking Watched? And what's the process for then taking it off the list? And that's what we're really looking for, is that specific process.
I think this is a question that Paul Jennings may have a bit more detail about the actual process in terms of the inspection regime and those conversations that happen with the responsible person. It is ultimately the decision of the responsible person as to whether a Waking Watch is put in place. I think clearly the main issue here is that It's over 4 years now since we understood the full issue in terms of what the risks of cladding is. So I think there's a massive time delay, and I can really understand the frustrations of all those who are left with cladding that hasn't been remediated. So again, my colleague Tom Copley has regular meetings with the groups concerned. I am happy to respond to any letters that they might send in. What I would say is that I'm confident that I haven't had a letter that I haven't responded to, but the main responsible person here at the City Hall for meeting those groups would be the Deputy Mayor and for Housing and Land and the Housing and Land team. So it's not that City Hall isn't engaging with the groups. It's perhaps that sort of confusion which, if this committee it isn't entirely clear which Deputy Mayor they should have in front of them to talk to them about it, then I can understand why people think because I've got fire in my job title it should be me. But so apologies if that hasn't been sort of communicated effectively to the groups. It's not a lack of sympathy for the plight they find themselves in. It's simply because that would come under Housing and Land.
So even the process would come under Housing and Land?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. No, the process wouldn't come under Housing and Land. The process is the fire brigade.
Could I ask Paul about the process then, please? Paul.
The process would be the responsible person would employ a competent person to carry out a fire risk assessment. And when they consider the fire risk assessment, if there are any building defects, as we mentioned, regarding cladding or compartmentation or cavity barriers alike, they would consider their risk assessment and determine what would be the best course of action. And what the guidance is really pushing them to do is to fit a common alarm rather than a waking watch. But depending on the risk involved, the immediacy of the risk, it might be that they put a waking watch in, immediately finding those defects, with the then thought to arrange for a common alarm to be fitted. As we've said though earlier, the speed of this work isn't happening as quickly as we need, and I personally have met lots of the cladding action groups with the NFCC and understand the pain that residents are going through at the moment.
And just as a final quick follow-up, are those criteria published anywhere?
It's the simultaneous evacuation guide that the NFCC publish. And sorry, just to add to that, so once they've decided that, we will then, the fire safety inspecting officers will then go and carry out an audit on those premises, look at the fire risk assessment and look at the decision-making process. And we also look at whether there's been over or under provision within those waking watch determinations, which obviously will have a bearing on the cost implications for residents.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you. Question for Fiona. September last year, the Mayor wrote to 40 landlords asking them to carry out remediation work to their buildings. Do you know how many of those landlords have started? How many have finished? Do you know the progress of that?
I'm going to have to revert to the. I will bring Tom Copley with me next time. Answer. I did have sight of the letter when it went out, but it was under the auspices of the Housing and Land work on this. But I think what I think is clear is that the Mayor takes the need for remediation really seriously. And I think I understand later on in the meeting, the committee might be talking about the New Providence Wharf building, and quite clearly if those remediation, the remediation work hadn't taken place there, and you can see why there's an urgent need to make sure that happens. So the fact I haven't got an answer isn't reflective of the urgency with which the Mayor and my colleague Tom Copley would be working to try to resolve this. And the numerous meetings that have happened, including I know that Tom Copley and Stephen Greenhalgh, the Development Minister, met some of these developers together. So this is something that we need to be clear it is urgent. Both government and the GLA are clear that it's urgent. And I think anything that this committee can do to work with sort of cross-party on this, as Tom Copley and Stephen Greenhalgh have been doing, would be really appreciated.
I've got some more questions, but all along the same lines.
Okay.
I don't want to add to Tom Copley's in tray any more than we already have. So
I don't know, I'm quite happy to, but...
All I can say for anybody watching that was hoping for some answers, I can only deeply apologise that with my colleagues' permission, I think we will bring this to the next fire committee and definitely request some information. Is it on this subject, the cladding?
It's still on section 1.
Yep.
It's at the end. I just have a question following on. Paul Jennings mentioned the high risk premises team, and I'm wondering, this is a question for Andy or Fiona really, but the government has previously provided welcome one-off funding for the building risk review, which included the high risk premises team. Given that the number of buildings identified as at risk is still rising, with a number of simultaneous evacuation orders having more than doubled since last October, is it possible that the government may offer up this funding again?
If I might answer this, so I think there's a good likelihood, because the government recognises both the pressure on London, particularly because of the scale of the building crisis in London, and because of the increased amount of activity, that funding will be baselined and will continue. That is what I anticipate at this point.
Okay, thanks. And just follow up on that, when was the high-risk premises team first set up?
Paul, perhaps you can give the Assembly member the detail of that, please.
Set the team up initially very shortly after Grenfell happened, but what we've done is since bolstered that team with additional resources and expertise once we had the government grant funding last June, I believe it was.
Okay, and it has that team, do you have a full complement in that team?
We do, yes.
You do, okay. And what does that work entail?
It's twofold really. We've been set the task of the building risk review, which is to go out and inspect and audit all the high-rise residential buildings within London before the end of this current calendar year, which we are well on trajectory to do. They set us in the region of 8,000 properties they believed, and that, for example, I think, and this is a national problem, the sort of unique identifiers around high-rise blocks and premises is not being clear. An example of that is New Providence Wharf, where only one block A, was recorded in the government figures, and there are a number of blocks on that estate. So they're coordinating that building risk review, so we've got fire station staff and inspecting officers visiting and auditing those premises. But they also act as a conduit and information exchange for residents, members of the public, housing associations, interaction with the GLA. So it is our sort of one-stop shop to ensure that the data and the understanding and the learning is coordinated and shared across the piece.
That's really interesting, thank you. And finally, how regularly does it monitor buildings with simultaneous evacuation orders in place?
We're constantly monitoring this.
Okay.
What we do is we're only publishing the updates on a monthly basis because the thirst for information was taking up more time collating that and publishing it to people than the actual work that I've just detailed. So I've asked them to just publish that, and I think the next set that Andy's quoted is due out on the 15th of July.
Thank you.
But we are seeing an increase above that 901.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, the last very quick one on this. It does seem that common alarms is a way for residents to get out of this waking watch sort of situation. I know it's difficult to give a price, but just supposing there's an 8-storey out there with 16 flats, very, very approximately, what would it cost those owners?
I haven't got those figures, unfortunately, Chair, but we could supply something as an example for
If
committee.
you could, because
Yes.
as both Assembly members and councillors, we are constantly being asked. And if it looks like it could be affordable, it's something that we could point residents in the direction of, because if it's a one-off cost, it's better than this endless watching brief. So if you could, that would be helpful, I'm sure, to my colleagues. Okay, we're now going on to the second section, which is fire safety, building safety legislation, and that's being led by my colleague, Assembly Member Clark.
The first question is to the Fire Commissioner. Earlier this year, you told the committee that the impact of fire safety regulation on the work of the Brigade is yet to emerge. Now that the Fire Safety Act has been implemented, do you have a clearer idea of what this means for the Brigade, and what action have you taken to mitigate the risk of greater workload for the Brigade?
So I think the first thing to say, to be clear, is that it's not been implemented, and we will not enforce against the new legislation until provided with a formal implementation date and instructions. So I think there's some confusion about this. It has not been implemented yet. So we welcome it because it provides clarity on the existing regulatory framework, and it should come into effect at the end of 2021-22. Our view is we're beginning to understand the impact it will have. I think in very basic terms for the committee, it will mean a vastly increased amount of regulatory fire safety activity for frontline staff, and Paul will be able to talk to that in more detail because he's responsible for leading the training programme whereby we train all of our operational firefighters to carry out frontline fire safety audits. It's going to result in an increase in audit activity on the most high-risk premises, but again, that's hard to quantify because as we understand the implementation of that legislation in the context of how complex a built environment London is, that is constantly changing, putting a quantity on it would simply be wrong. It's something that's going to emerge as we get into the actual practice of implementation. Does that give you enough of an answer, committee member?
Okay, thank you. And given the importance of the Building Safety Bill for Londoners, what discussions have you had with the government regarding timescales and when the bill will be brought to Parliament?
So obviously the bill was published on Monday, the 5th of July, and it's a very substantial piece of legislation, so in excess of 218 pages. We're working our way through that detail at the moment, and we maintain almost constant dialogue with government about this. We have a dedicated team set up to help colleagues in central and government and the GLA form and shape that legislation. So again, it's about emerging understanding of it.
I understand. Yeah, thank you for that. And do you think the Building Safety Bill should change the definition of higher risk buildings to include all supported accommodation as well as residential care homes, regardless of height, to ensure vulnerable people are protected?
So I think that the best answer to this is that I certainly as Commissioner have continued reservations about higher risk buildings, how they're going to be initially defined. You know, I'm not particularly comfortable that they're only using a height threshold as a determiner. It's too blunt an instrument to really account for risk, and the sort of buildings you've just described might well appropriately sit within our understanding of a higher risk building. I think what we've got to do is continue to make that point to central government and work with them to kind of certainly inform secondary guidance and legislation to really consider what a high-risk building is, because I think it would be fair to acknowledge that the published bill has reduced the number of buildings in scope of the regulator by raising the height threshold, even from what was proposed in the draft building safety bill. So as I said, we're considering the full detail of that bill as published at the moment, and we will seek to work with government to ensure that from our professional perspective as the Fire and Rescue Service for London, there is an appropriate determiner for what a high-risk building is, because at the moment, I think you're right to raise that question. I would not consider it to be appropriately determined at this point.
Okay. And are you confident that the Building Safety Regulator will complement existing regimes and processes in London?
I think we've got to see how it works. I think it's an excellent step in the right direction. I think it's been set up with the right intent, but I think it's important to remember that the bill is primarily enabling legislation, and that the work of the regulator and other bodies such as ourselves will be very much framed by the secondary legislation which can be expected in the future, and therefore our kind of effort, our conversations with government are very focused not just on the bill as published, but on what is going to follow to ensure that both the regulator and ourselves in our own enforcement arena and regulatory advice arena have practical measures we can use to tackle what is a very significant issue in London.
Thank you. And this next question is perhaps also for you, Fiona, but the Commissioner may have something to say. The Building Safety Bill will bring in a wide range of new responsibilities for London boroughs. What discussions have you had with boroughs to ensure that there will be a smooth transition as the bill is implemented?
In what sense in relation to fire? I was going to comment on the regulator, if I might. I'm going to take the advantage that you brought me in to say I had a really useful and very welcome discussion with the Home Office on Monday, and and there was a colleague from Housing and Land there as well, reflecting that sort of dual role. I think that the role of the regulator is a really key one that I think this committee and the Housing Committee are likely to want to focus on. And I basically sort of asked whether the regulator was going to have teeth, and hopefully, because it's going to be sat within HSE, which is viewed as having teeth, hopefully it would have. But actually they introduced that quite interesting dynamic as you want a regulator to approach a resident very differently from a developer. So I think there's some very nuanced discussions around how the regulator will operate that are worth exploring. And I'm going to use my Tom Copley card and say it's Tom Copley that works with the boroughs on this. That's not to say that I don't talk to boroughs, but it would be... it would actually be a waste of resource for both of us to be having the same conversation, the same people, and I suspect the boroughs might get a little bit annoyed. So I think I've already indicated to him and his team that he will be invited along next time probably. So and I know he'd be very happy to answer those questions and have informal meetings and briefings with colleagues on the Assembly before that as well.
Thank you for that. And back to the Commissioner. How do you expect the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Act to change the work of the Brigade?
I think I'd go back to my first answer, which is I think a real increase in advice giving and regulatory activity because of the widening of the scope of the legislation to include so many other buildings in London. I mean, to put it in perspective, the old legislation, which was the Regulatory Reform Order, already encompassed over 800,000 buildings in London. Which we would consider within the scope of the regulations, and therefore there would be a need to audit on a risk-based approach. That number is likely to vastly increase within the context of the scope of the regulation as it stands, you know, as it's proposed now. So I think the simple answer is just a real increase in the level of activity surrounding fire safety for both our crews and our specialist officers. To give you an indication of that, having trained all frontline firefighters to carry out the most basic form of fire safety audit, we would anticipate in excess of an additional 20,000 visits a year carried out by those crews.
Wow, okay. And this is to both Fiona and the Commissioner. Do you agree with the London Assembly that the Building Safety Bill should be amended to alleviate the financial burden on leaseholders and tenants living in buildings with dangerous cladding or other fire safety defects? And what action will you take to address this?
Absolutely, and I think we will be making representations throughout the course of the bill to ensure this happens, and it's already come up on the initial conversations we've had with the Home Office. It's absolutely unacceptable for people that bought their properties, largely flats obviously in good faith, to be charged for the remediation of the buildings, and I referred to the proposals around the levy on major private developers that could raise up to £3 billion to fund this work. We're not saying government should fund everything or that government's got an unlimited amount, but actually the cause of this crisis sits with the developers to a certain extent, and I think as well as sort of tighter rules around building safety, they should definitely be part of the solution in terms of funding the cost of the remediation, not least given the large profits some of these organisations will have had.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Bakari.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the Commissioner whether he'd consider working with City Hall on looking at an awareness campaign around the new unlimited fines that could be placed on so-called responsible persons who do not complete follow-up fire risk assessments properly following the passage of the Fire Safety Bill, to try and encourage better practice across London.
I think that's an excellent question, and actually it's exactly the sort of thing we're considering. We work very closely with GLA colleagues anyway. As I referred to before, that Fire Safety Act is not yet implemented, but one of the key aspects of it on implementation will be ensuring we communicate effectively to building owners and managers what our actions are likely to be, and the very serious range of enforcement that will be available to us in relation to that act. So the answer is yes. We absolutely will be working with all relevant stakeholders to ensure that the provisions of the Act are communicated effectively, and our responsibilities within that to those people who need to have that information the most.
Great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're now going to move on to progress on key targets on the London Safety Plan and the London Fire Brigade performance. Okay, we're going over now to Marina Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. It's great to see you here. This is a question for both the Deputy Mayor and the Fire Commissioner. Are you confident that the key targets in the London Safety Plan will be met by the extended deadline of March 2022?
I'm happy to answer if that's appropriate, Chair.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So the answer is yes, absolutely. So we have 5 remaining ongoing commitments which are reporting as on track, and we now view them as being delivered as business as usual by their respective departments. And Fiona Dolman, who is my Director of Transformation, who's here today, will be able to provide you more information on what those 5 are if you would like that. And we have 2 commitments which were completed in Q4 before the Mayor's final deadline, which was in relation to commitment to offer apprenticeships as part of our firefighter development programme in other parts of the workforce, which has been up and running for some time very successfully, and to review financial arrangements to see if there are further opportunities for collaboration, which actually I view as business as usual anyway. It's something we constantly review and consider as part of normal business. Does that give you enough information?
Yes, if we can come back onto the issue of apprentices a little later in my questions. Again, for you, Commissioner, is the Brigade's computer-based home fire safety visit app now up and running? And if so, how many people have completed an online home fire safety visit using the app, and how many have been prioritised for a face-to-face visit as a result?
Yes, so it is up and running, but only recently. I'm going to turn to my colleague, Paul Jennings, who may be able to give you the detail of the numbers. Paul, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Yes, the online checker went live in April of this year, and to date we've seen 1,249 individuals complete the triage section of that. 70% of those triaged were directed to continue online, of which half completed the full self-assessment. And then we're analysing the effectiveness of that system. It's early days yet, and we're going to write out to all housing associations and partners to publicise that, and we've got an ongoing communications campaign. And it's going to be part of our blended approach now towards home fire safety visits, picking up the lessons that we've learned during COVID.
Thank you. Commissioner Rowe, what action is the Brigade taking to reintroduce and mitigate the impact the pandemic has had on its youth engagement work, which was obviously very important pre-pandemic?
So obviously we've undertaken a youth review to really look at what the offer is for our youth services. I suppose the thing to really note is that despite the pandemic, we pushed forward on the basis of the funding we received from the Mayor, which we're very grateful for, to open a cadet unit in every single borough in London, which despite, again, the constraints of the pandemic, we did successfully within the timescales we had previously promised. And I'm pleased to report that we do indeed have a cadet unit in every borough in London now.
Thank you. And then staying again with the issue of COVID, How is COVID-19 currently affecting the work of the Brigade, and what does this mean in terms of medium and the long-term future?
Yeah, so inevitably, like all organisations, you know, COVID has had an impact on our day-to-day business in terms of what we can safely carry out. We followed government guidance in terms of how we might appropriately interact with people in the home. We have always kind of reviewed that in the context of, as the guidance changed, we would shift our activities. I think the way I would explain this in terms of how it's impacting us is that when we were inspected by HMIC FRS, they were very clear that they thought we were very quick to review our plans. They recognised our readiness to work with others, and it was recognised as an example of best practice in terms of how you would have responded to the pandemic. Examples of activities we carried out. So we've diversified massively, really, in support of London. So since April 2020, nearly 500 London firefighters volunteering to drive ambulances, supporting the LAS to respond to now over 150,000 incidents. 100 members of staff volunteered to recover the bodies of Londoners who sadly died from COVID-19 in their homes. You know, as the pandemic has developed and the needs of London society has moved with it, we've moved with that. So, for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, it was about ensuring support into the logistics network in London. We delivered 21 million items of PPE to local authorities and care providers. Now, the priority is vaccination. And again, we've responded by supporting 8 pop-up vaccination events, which are carrying on. So we've got more and more planned, allowing GPs to vaccinate in the heart communities with members of the public that might not otherwise have made their way to vaccination centres. So I think that our response across the stretch of the pandemic has been to respond to London's needs, and throughout that we have maintained our core response alongside it. We have maintained our response times. We have continued to inspect the most high-risk buildings, and our staff have maintained admirably low numbers of absence as well. So I think all in all, the response to COVID has been an absolute example of how adaptable, flexible and resilient the Brigade is.
If I can add to that, I think I'm hugely proud of the work the LFB has done so far during the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is far from over, and both in terms of contributing to the COVID-19 response, but particularly in relation to doing that while continuing to deliver their core service to Londoners. So the Commissioner is quite modest, but I think a large part of this has actually been down to his leadership and his drive and his determination for the Brigade to contribute to that overall response as not just a separate agency from other emergency services or from the response, but as a key partner within the strategic coordination of the response to the pandemic. And I think it isn't necessarily an agency that you would have necessarily expected to be a major part of the SCG in that way. But actually, I think under Andy's leadership, it really did. And I think the Mayor has recognised that and has thanked Andy and publicly on a number of occasions. But I think every single member of the Brigade, the trade unions, the staff, the teams, everybody pulled together to make sure not only that the Brigade continued to deliver their own sort of core functions and service, but also delivered on behalf of Londoners at a point of crisis. And I think it's been really positive and encouraging to see that that's also been recognised by the Inspectorate. So I think that sort of external validation should also be noted, and I know Andy mentioned it in his response. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor, and I've no doubt that the whole of London has, I always believe that all our emergency services, we should be on our bended knees in gratitude to, and that of course includes the fire service. Thank you for pointing that out, Deputy Mayor. Commissioner, again, so a couple of questions here in relation to the London Ambulance Service, and I appreciate that we don't have anybody from the LAS here, so if you could answer these as best as you can. How many staff are still working on deployment with the London Ambulance Service?
So that number's changing again. Up until quite recently, we had approximately 50. At the height of the pandemic, we had about 500. As the need to support the ambulance had decreased in line with the impact COVID was having on the ambulance service, it reduced down to about 50. But actually, as we've seen the third wave begin to hit London, there's been a request in to step those numbers back up to around the 120, 130 point, which we're actively considering at the moment, taking into account the other pressures on us from COVID in the medium to long term. But I do anticipate us meeting that request and bringing those numbers back up to that level.
Thank you. And where is the funding for this work coming from? And is an agreement already in place for this?
Yep, so we have a formal MOU in place with the London Ambulance Service, all funds that pay for that staff time, so both any related overtime, the staff wages themselves, all associated costs are funded through Department of Health. So we recover that money and have done repeatedly since the start of that arrangement.
Thank you. And is the deployment of staff to the London Ambulance Service impacting on the actual work of the brigade itself? And how, if that's the case, how is this being managed?
So we consider the impact of that support continuously. We look at our own response times, which of course have ironically improved over the course of the pandemic, perhaps because there is less traffic on the roads. We consider it in the context of maintaining training and availability for our legal responsibilities in the context of the Fire and Rescue Services Act. So we review it continuously. We have a planning framework around business continuity led by my Deputy Commissioner that meets weekly to make sure that, you know, in the important work of supporting our other emergency service colleagues across London, we are not, of course, compromising our own legal responsibilities.
Thank you. And again, for you, Commissioner, what has the London Fire Brigade used learning from the pandemic to inform future decision making and adapt for the longer term?
So I think that's a really good question, and it's something we're engaged with continuously. So the group I referred to, which is known as the Commissioners' Continuity Group, also has a series of working groups sitting within that framework, one of which is specifically dedicated to review and learning. So we're capturing all of the learning we can from our experiences across the pandemic. That is being formed into a series of formal reports that then are brought to me and the wider executive to consider how it might impact our strategic priorities and decision making moving forward. So there is a formalised process to capture learning and to take best practice and embed that for the future. Because I think the one thing, as I said at the start, that this pandemic has demonstrated is the absolute flexibility, adaptability, the kind of leadership that LFB can bring to a crisis. And it would be wrong of us not to capture that and consider how it might impact all other areas of our business.
Thank you. In January 2021, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services recommended that the brigade should focus on three main areas when planning for the future to be as efficient and as effective as possible. Do you agree with these recommendations, and what action is the brigade taking to address them?
Yes, I agree with the recommendations of the Inspectorate. I think they've come in and they considered this objectively, and they laid out a series of priorities that I wouldn't dispute. We have a detailed plan in respect to both those recommendations, the recommendations arising from previous inspections, which reports regularly to my board, and we are working our way through that plan.
Thank you. And my final question, again for you, Commissioner. Now, believe it or not, there is other news other than the football. I know that we might not appreciate that, but the other big bit of news is about the easing of restrictions. How is the brigade preparing for the easing of restrictions in London?
So obviously you've got the extant strategic partnership protocol. So we sit, as the Deputy Mayor has referred to, as part of SCG, all the working groups associated with it, in our responsibility to host the London Resilience Group on behalf of London. So the resilience planning Secretariat, we work very closely with all the other functional bodies, health in particular, and we are really on an almost continual basis planning against the changes to guidance and the possible impacts, both in terms of the wider partnership, but also our own individual service. So what I would reassure the committee is by saying that we're looking at this continuously. As the guidance changes, we change. We're considering the impact across everything from leave to training events, to staff welfare and COVID fatigue, the pressure to catch up with business as usual, and of course core service provision. So we look across all those areas continuously, and we have detailed plans in place that reflect both official guidance and the likely impact that we agree with our partners it might have on London and Londoners.
Okay, thank you, panel. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Rogers.
My question's actually been answered.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Polensky.
Thank you. My question's for the London Fire Commissioner. First of all, I want to applaud the work you're doing with the community, particularly with the cadet units. It's brilliant to hear that they're every borough. My question is specifically about the online referral pathways. I know the plan was to connect young people with specialist youth services through the London Fire Brigade. Could you give us an update with how this is going, please?
If I could turn to Paul Jennings, please, because alongside fire safety, he also has responsibility for our youth provision and community safety. So, Paul, please.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, we're working with the GLA and the Mayor's peer review team, which open up opportunities for us to explore, like you say, different referral pathways. We're also part of the Safety First collaboration scheme, where it's a joint scheme with the LAS and the Met, where we're also going into primary schools. So we're seeing some benefit from that. But it's early days in terms of those referral schemes, and maybe we'll have more information. I can come back to you at a later date.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, just a couple from me. Regarding the app, the fire safety app, the people we're most concerned about very often are people of advancing years and who are vulnerable, and they are the ones that unfortunately don't have computers or can't use computers. So whilst I applaud this, with the people we need to get to are the really vulnerable, and I would suggest they're not the ones with the computers, but I still applaud it as a way of getting through. But I make that comment because they're not always the people we need to get to. The other thing with my budget hat on, Commissioner, you were saying that the government's paying for the money for firefighters to be on the tenders. I was always under the impression the firefighters were on their normal pay, but I now believe that they get an enhanced amount of money to work on the ambulances. Is that correct?
That's correct, to reflect a change in working circumstances and shifts that was agreed with the Fire Brigades Union at the start of the pandemic, and that is also included within the funding from health.
Can you send me details on that, please?
Yes, of course.
That's not quite what my understanding was, but it would be interesting. Was that because of a union insistence, because it was a change of working circumstances?
It was a negotiated arrangement that was done extremely quickly in defence of the Fire Brigades Union at the start of the pandemic. We had people on the ambulances within, I think, 2 weeks of the request coming in.
I'm not questioning that, Commissioner. I'm questioning exactly how much that's costing either the brigade or the government. But thank you for that. My colleague, Assembly Member Rogers, has just indicated.
Thank you. Sorry, I did actually have a few brief questions on the app, maybe to the Commissioner or to yourself, Paul. How much did the app cost to develop, and was it developed in-house or was it commissioned externally?
I believe it was in the region of £150,000, and we went external to achieve that piece of work. It's the first iteration of something that we're going to look to expand on. So we're talking a lot today about the built environment. The next step that we want to take is to produce something that will look at something that will help responsible persons, building owners, businesses to a sort of self-help tool. So that's our next focus on that piece of work.
Thank you. And one thing I may have missed, you answered the question about numbers of people using it and how many people have completed the assessments. But how many people were prioritised for a face-to-face visit from this, and have any of those visits actually taken place yet?
I haven't got those numbers to hand. I know that they would have been prioritised during the the pandemic, when we didn't have the app, we were using a telephone-based system, and during that year we were able to carry out 24,000 home fire safety visits.
Okay, would you be able to get back to us about how many face-to-face visits have been?
I can provide that, yes.
That'd be great, thank you very much. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, lovely, thank you very much. We're now moving on to our next section. My colleague Hina Bakar is heading up.
Chair. Equality and diversity is a particular passion of mine, so I'm going to be probably focusing on this probably more than anything else in this committee, so I don't apologise for that because I think this is incredibly important. This is a question for the Commissioner. What progress has the Brigade made with the recruitment and retention? I'm going to not use the word BAE, I'm going to use the word ethnic minorities and women firefighters, and what do the attrition rates show?
So thank you. If we can perhaps split that answer into two parts. So for the first time since we set those targets in 2017, the Brigade has actually exceeded the targets set around recruitment of both women and colleagues from across the many communities of London. What I would say is that's never enough. We're nowhere near close enough yet to a Brigade that I think truly represents London's communities, and it is my intent not to become complacent on that and continue to push progress. So to give you an understanding of those numbers, the trainee intake impact between March 2019 and March 2021, the percentage of women recruited into operational roles in the fire service has increased from 7.4% to 8.9%. The percentage of staff from ethnic minorities has increased from 13.1% to 14.4%. But again, I would aspire to do better than that. I think complacency is kind of the enemy of kind of growing a diverse workforce, and there is nothing more important to me than ensuring that London Fire Brigade both represents and serves the communities of London properly.
Thank you, and I really appreciate your honesty in saying that it could be better. And the Deputy Mayor's role is essentially to make sure that the Brigade is doing this particular job. Are you content with the actions of the Commissioner? Do you think he could do better?
I think by his own admission, I think he's already said that he thinks the Brigade could do better, but I think that acknowledging that the Brigade could do better is a first step in terms of ensuring what is our shared priority, which is to make sure that the Brigade looks and feels like the city it represents, not simply to look and feel like the city it represents, but so that you've got the understanding and the confidence of the communities it serves. So I think this is something that we regularly discuss at my monthly board with the Brigade. I have regular meetings with Tim Powell, Director of People Services, and his deputy, Kate Bonham, who some members will know from her time at MOPAC. I'm really confident that the Brigade is really focused on this as a priority, and it comes back to this in pretty much every meeting, every conversation I have with senior Brigade staff. So I think, yes, the London Fire Brigade could be in a better position in terms of diversity and equality. However, I think that when I talk to senior staff responsible for driving this through, I'm absolutely confident that they share this as a priority and a commitment, albeit it's one that will take some time to resolve. There isn't a magic wand on this. This takes hard graft and very detailed research in terms of making sure that the messaging around recruitment is right, that the understanding of how you recruit but then how you retain and allow people to progress through the organisation is right, and so forth, and actually the detailed monitoring. And we looked at the HR Digest this week at my board meeting, having a look and an honest discussion about the figures and where things could improve is clearly a first step towards improving the diversity of the organisation. I don't know whether Fiona or Andy want to comment further on that.
I think what I would say to the Assembly member is that this is, one of my absolute top priorities. And we are transparent that whilst I think there's been a real improvement in our baseline recruitment strategy, how we reach out to communities and ensure that they are able to access the opportunities that the London Fire Brigade offer, but therefore we also gain the benefit of those people in our organisation being able to better serve their own communities. There is more to do. And I think perhaps it would be useful if we wrote to you with further detail around retention and the experience of colleagues when they work in the brigade. And I'm happy to do that and provide that to you, because I think that information would be of interest to you, and I would welcome the opportunity to discuss it further with you.
Because particularly I'm actually quite interested to see within your approach that you are engaging directly with staff and firefighters themselves from the underrepresented groups, and to really understand their lived experiences. Is that something that you are doing then within this?
Yes, I meet regularly across both the equality support groups. Personally, I meet with groups of different firefighters representing different parts of London's communities and their representatives. I think it's a vital part of my own leadership practice, because I need to hear from those people inside the organisation about their experiences in order to drive the best strategic approach. I think there's no other way of doing it. So I'll give you an example. Within the last couple of weeks, I sat and met with a colleague called Karen Bell, who's the lead representative for black firefighters within the brigade, and we talked at length about the experience of those she represents. I regularly meet with large groups of black firefighters and women firefighters to talk about their experiences. I've met recently with a cohort of recent trainees who very much represent the kind of sort of young people we would aspire to employ in the brigade, and listen to their experiences. So I'm very, very interested in hearing what it's like to work for the London Fire Brigade, and how, in working for us, we best serve those communities that so many of our firefighters come from.
I'm really pleased to hear that, and it gives me some confidence that your passion is just as equal to mine about getting this improved. But we also need to make sure that we've got clear objectives and timescales. And the review that you're doing right now about the culture within the London Fire Brigade and how it's progressing, do you have very clear aims and purposes that we can, assess clearly?
Yes. So there's very clear terms of reference, which we've agreed with the Deputy Mayor. We are shortly to commence the select committee process to appoint an independent chair. And working with that independent chair, we will continue to refine those terms of reference, which I'm happy to make available, because that clarity is going to be very important for our own staff and for our external stakeholders to have confidence in this review. It's a particularly important piece of work. I want the London Fire Brigade to be the best possible place to come and work for all sections of London's communities, and therefore, in being so, offering the best service to those communities.
Brilliant. Deputy Mayor, I believe that you would be working very closely on this as well. And what involvement have you had in when it comes to defining these aims and purposes of this review?
I've had regular discussions with the brigade. In fact, we've also facilitated a number of discussions between the wider GLA and the Fire Brigade on this issue, including the Deputy Mayor for Communities and Social Justice and her team, to ensure that we've shared expertise and experience, and that we make sure that we have absolutely the strongest terms of reference, that we have the strongest process in place to give every member of staff, the Commissioner and other stakeholders, the confidence that we've got the right independent chair in place. That is really important. And I think that I'm trying to think of a week that's gone by recently where we haven't discussed this, and to note that actually this is a theme that we've been covering in the regular meetings that the Commissioner has with the Mayor as well. So it's not just my involvement and my understanding and my interest in this. This is something that the Mayor himself is taking a personal interest in, and will continue to do so to make sure that we get the right outcomes of the culture review, which can't just be another nice document that people go, oh, that's great. It's got to be a lived document that actually informs the work and the culture of the organisation, that every single member of staff sees themselves reflected in, but actually also that they get that kind of culture and working environment that the Commissioner has mentioned he aspires to, which would be one in which everybody is comfortable and supported, but also you get that really strong supportive culture that means that issues are addressed as they come up, and you get a very supportive team culture at every level of the organisation, and that we get an organisation that's fit for the 21st century. And I think I'm really confident that the Commissioner and his senior team are really all pushing for this, and I know that it's an issue that when we have an independent chair in place, I'm sure he or she would be very happy to come to this committee to talk to members as well.
Sounds like there's definitely an ownership about this approach from every level, and I'm really pleased to hear that. Commissioner, how is the Brigade's Togetherness strategy progressing, and what has it achieved so far?
So it's been 12 months since the Togetherness strategy was published. We've had good progress against what was a very detailed action plan that arose from that strategy. So 10 actions complete, a further 59 ongoing and continued actions. So highlights of that, an absolute step change in the organisation's approach to equality impact assessment. You know, that's a system and process issue, but it's particularly important that people, you know, support that with the right culture as well, take that seriously. And we're beginning to see really detailed work around that moving forward across the whole areas of policy and delivery. Governance processes, we've got a board that I chair that sits as part of that strategy. We've met 4 times, and we have a representative committee sitting alongside that to support the governance of it and hold me to account, frankly. And we have, for the first time, you know, and I think that does say something about the past history of the Brigade. For the first time, we have external participants on that board who, again, bring a level of expertise and challenge to it to hold me and the Brigade to account. There's the launch of the LFB People Awards, you know, a significant improvement in our approach to recognition with a particular focus on diversity and inclusion. A really resounding success with over 170 nominations across 11 categories designed to be linked to our transformation delivery plan and our behavioural framework. Community engagement and togetherness. Our inclusion team has been working really closely with our community engagement team to design and deliver a pilot which focuses on ensuring borough plans have inclusion embedded at their core, and engagement activities relating to our forthcoming community risk management plan, considering the protected characteristics of communities through, again, very robust equality impact assessment. So a whole range of work that seeks to place inclusion at the centre of our decision making, our thinking, recognising that if we get that right, we're going to deliver the best service to the widest range of communities in London. So
it sounds like the people who sit on the Togetherness board are a fairly diverse group who are very community based. You're meeting regularly, I presume, as well?
Yeah, so I meet them outside of that. But also I think the point I'd make is that in our wider strategy, we are trying to turn the focus really to a community-led approach. So I don't just meet within the context of that Togetherness strategy with the board and all the representative groups I've already talked about. You know, I also, for example, regularly meet with members of the Grenfell community. I meet with members of other community groups to consider their interest, their understanding of what the Brigade means to them. You know, what does inclusion look like from their perspective? And I think in that sense, that's how we're using inclusion to drive our strategic priorities and delivery.
Would you mind sharing in writing later on just exactly who is sitting on the board, where they come from, what communities, etc.? It would be really good to get that information. And lastly, the Togetherness strategy says that the London Fire Brigade will build strong relationships between its internal and external communities, which you've just mentioned, and helps make great decisions. Can you provide an example of what great decisions have been made?
I think in the way we approach our community engagement, and that's perhaps been driven from a harder place, because almost immediately after I assumed the role of Commissioner, and as part of, frankly, this strategy and our intent, I met with those people most profoundly affected by the Grenfell Tower fire, so the Grenfell communities, both Grenfell United and in particular the Next of Kin group. And they were very clear about what they wanted to see in terms of how we engage not just with them and the wider communities of people who live in high rises in London, but our general approach to community engagement in London. That has been embedded in the forming of a completely new community engagement team. So those meetings directly inform the way we set up a completely new approach to community engagement, a dedicated team led by someone we brought in from the outside who has fantastic experience in a range of other organisations in terms of leading community engagement. It has led to a pilot scheme across 8 boroughs that, again, completely reframes the way we tackle community engagement. And if you want to look at a particularly profound example of that, our approach to community engagement in the immediate aftermath of the New Providence Wharf fire was an example of that decision being made and then enacted on the ground to the benefit of communities who at that point felt extremely vulnerable, highly exposed by the unsafe built environment they were in, and were looking for our immediate support, perhaps in a way we hadn't discharged immediately post Grenfell as we should have.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, and I really hope all this work really results in what we all want. And if we can get the first Muslim hijabi firefighter in London, I'd be really, really thrilled.
Well, so would I. I echo that. Thank you.
Right. I've got several people asking extra questions. Can I ask both questioners and the Commissioner to keep it as short as you can? We're running over. So the first person that's indicated, Assembly Member Rogers.
Thank you. Commissioner, you said earlier that you want the London Fire Brigade to be the best possible place to work for all of London's communities. And yet, London Fire Brigade data says that 2/3 of LGBT staff are not comfortable disclosing their identity at work, which I think is a pretty damning statistic. I come from a railway background, which is a very robust environment, but there's never any question that people couldn't be open about their identity. So my questions to you are, what behaviours, policies and structures within the LFB are contributing to the fact that LGBT people don't feel comfortable being out at work? And how are you supporting LGBT staff? Also bearing in mind that people who are not comfortable disclosing their identities are unlikely to join a support network and therefore will need supporting in other ways.
I think it's an excellent question. The first thing I'd say is I think the data you've just referred to is just wholly unacceptable to me as Commissioner. And I suppose the answer to it is in the work we're carrying through the Togetherness strategy, which recognises that for some parts of the London Fire Brigade, not everyone feels safe at work. You know, that's manifest in a range of data, not only the experiences of our LGBT plus community colleagues, but also the experiences of women in the fire service, black and other ethnic minority colleagues in the fire service. I would be the first to acknowledge that there is a range of data that shows the experience of working in the London Fire Brigade is not consistent in terms of the standard of behaviour I would expect nor demand for everyone who works for us. I think the solution to this is multifaceted and long-term. It's embedded in the culture review. I expect that to become a safe place for those staff to really express how they feel and how they might help us change as an organisation. We are providing training around inclusion to every level of manager. I have been clear, as have my senior leaders, that we cannot tolerate an environment where people can't be their whole selves at work. And we are embedding both learning and clear reference to the standards we expect in every aspect of both our leadership programs, which are rolling out, but also in our performance management program, which is rolling out. So we are holding people to the behaviours we expect in a much more robust way than I think has happened in the past. And I expect that to, over time, change the environment. But I am not blind to the scale of the challenge, nor the fact that not everyone currently in the London Fire Brigade does feel they can be their whole selves at work. That is unacceptable to me as Commissioner, and I'll be driving change forward with an energy in that regard.
Thank you. Cultural change takes time. It takes a lot of time to embed change in an organisation. What are you doing in the short term to make sure that LGBT staff members are supported and made safe Are there ways in which they can raise issues in private with external people or with their managers?
Yep. So we're in the process now, and I expect it to be completed by the end of July, setting up an externally monitored safe to speak process, as is currently carried out in the NHS and in fact in the transport industry quite often. So it's a place where staff will be able to go anonymously to speak to someone who is able to hear their complaint and safely pass it back to the organisation. Obviously we have extant whistleblowing processes that are well tried and tested as well. So we're expanding that and publicising it to ensure that there is indeed a safe place for people to make their discomfort and their anxieties known, their complaint known, and then we will be externally scrutinised in our ability to respond to that. So that's one part of it. The second thing is that we are actively championing the role of the equality support groups. We have senior leaders acting as champions for all those groups and proactively going out to encourage that people might join them and again find another safe space to speak.
Thank
Beyond
you,
that,
Commissioner.
it really is
sorry,
that
I appreciate we're on the
process
clock
of
here,
change
so
embedded in
I'm happy
training
with that answer.
Thank
and
you,
leadership.
Commissioner. Thank you. Thank you. We must keep this briefer, please. Assembly Member Polanski.
My questions are on the LGBT staff too. They were just asked rather well.
Lovely.
So I'll pass.
Thank you very much. Assembly Member Dr. Sahota.
My question was also on LGBT, which has been asked already.
Yes,
but just to ask the Commissioner, look, you've put a lot of changes into place, but which you hope will bring about this change. But are you seeing any evidence of any change taking place already? Are you seeing any green shoots of the culture changing? Have you seen any evidence of that yourself?
I think the evidence I've seen is around the awareness of the behavioural framework now. That's clear in the kind of data we gather across all parts of the organisation, that people are well aware that we have a behavioural framework now. They are well aware that people are going to be managed robustly within the context of that framework. I think that the people survey that we're going to bring forward in the next couple of months will give us a data refresh around how much impact the strategy over the last 12 months has made. But I do think we have some way to go. I think this is the beginnings of a journey to really address the less edifying aspects of our culture. And as your colleague on the committee noted, that will take time. So I think, yes, we're seeing the early start to a change in behaviours and understanding what an inclusive workplace looks like. But it is early days, and the cultural review is where I hope we will really begin to make that impact.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Very, very briefly, the culture is something that is concerning all of us. I'm exceptionally concerned. Many of us will have read the very, very sad situation of Jaden Francis Esprit, who committed suicide. I have been informed that very sadly there was another one within this last week. How many suicides have they been in the Brigade in the last 5 years?
Chair, we can write to you with the exact details of that, but I can tell you that over the course of the pandemic, I'm afraid I have personally had to deal with 4 suicides in the Brigade, and in the year prior to that, a further 2. That is an unacceptably high number, and we are thinking very carefully about how we put in place all the additional mitigations there might be to prevent another tragedy of that kind.
Yes, Commissioner, it is totally unacceptable, and a culture change that takes years. I fear for how many other people we may lose. This is something that's got to be dealt with very, very quickly, and it's something that this committee will be looking at and pushing on all the time. I will accept the numbers from you as soon as possible.
So could I come in on this? Because I think that this is absolutely something that the Brigade share your concern about. And I had a very detailed conversation with Deputy Commissioner Richard Mills earlier in the week about specific actions he was taking to address this in the short term, including trying to identify research that would give insight into what other organisations had done. This is absolutely not something that will wait until the culture review is completed. This is something that the Brigade is working on now, and it's something that I've already had 2 detailed conversations with Richard Mills actually in the course of this week, as well as speaking to the Commission about the tragic death that took place this week as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we
If I
send
could
our
perhaps
condolences
just very
to
quickly, Chair,
everybody
add to that.
involved. Right,
The death of Jade and Francois Esprit was not only a tragedy, it happened on my watch. I take full responsibility for taking any measures required to ensure that might not happen again. And we will not wait for the culture
Well, it
review
has,
to finish
Commissioner,
to act
and
on it.
I think we'll leave it at that, because obviously it's a very sad situation. Yeah. But I would like the figures, and I would like, and this committee would like, to know as a matter of urgency how this is going to be really dealt with. Okay, we're moving on now to Transformation Delivery Plan, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report, and the HMIC FRS inspection, and that's going to be led by my colleague, Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you, Chair. So it's going to cover quite a lot of ground, which obviously I'm going to try and do reasonably quickly because we are a bit pressed for time. And I'd like to start with the Deputy Mayor for Fire and Resilience, if I may. And obviously we've got the Transformation and Delivery Plan, which is meeting some of these various reports that have been made and inspections that have happened. So are you satisfied with the progress that has been made by the London Fire Commissioner and the Fire Brigade in implementing the Brigade's Transformation Delivery Plan, including the various recommendations from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Part 1 and also Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary various inspections?
So I think the full list of what you outlined indicates the extent of the challenge the Brigade is facing. There is change on almost every front. So, and I think in relation to your initial question, when the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report was published in 2019, it had some really challenging findings for the LFB, making it clear that fundamental changes were needed. And the previous comments by the Chair indicate that actually that was only part of the fundamental changes that was needed, and clearly the culture review is a whole other piece that has emerged subsequently. But in relation to the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Phase 1 report, the Mayor and the LFB have accepted all of the recommendations, and since then Andy Rowe, as the Commissioner of the LFB, put in place a new leadership team and has been focusing on delivering the inquiry recommendations as part of a wider transformation programme, which I'm sure you'll bring Fiona in on shortly, as she's sort of overseeing this work. So 18 out of the 29 recommendations aimed at the LFB by the inquiry have been completed, and the work will continue and will continue as a matter of priority until they're all complete. What I would say is, am I satisfied that they're not all complete? If you ask the Commissioner the same question, I'm sure he'll say, no, we would have loved them to go faster. Some of them have proved much more complicated to complete than initially thought. Some of them have already been demonstrated to make the change that has been evidenced. For example, I think the New Providence Wharf fire and the approach to that, including the fire safety, fire survival guidance calls, a number of the approaches, including smoke hoods, that were applied, have demonstrated that not only has there been a paper exercise in terms of changing policy, but that policy sort of working through. So, and I had a really good session on the board I held early in the week with Ali Hay, the LFB's independent operational assurance advisor, and apologies, I probably got his job title wrong, but he's been looking into specific policies, and actually that has been his bit of the jigsaw has been held up slightly by COVID, because until he was able to go and see in person that the change that was outlined in the policy was being put in practice on the ground, he wasn't prepared to say that he had been assured that the policy he was looking at had been carried through. So I think for me, the bit that I feel most confident about is the fact that these aren't just paper changes. These are changes that we have been given assurance and reassurance on, that they're actually having real impact and change on the ground in the practice and policies that are used on a daily basis by the Brigade.
And I think we've talked about this in previous meetings, and I think the impact of COVID, which you've just mentioned, I think the other area, and we came across that in some of our previous questioning, where we're talking about the impact on shared owners and leaseholders and Waking Watch, and we're talking a lot about the crossover into the Deputy Mayor for Housing and Land. Some of the recommendations, of course, were joint things as well, weren't they? They weren't just in the gift of the Fire Brigade, all of the 29 recommendations. Has that held things back at all, having to sort of see them through, or has it been more the impact of COVID, which you did mention?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to state one particular reason why things have been delayed. It's not just COVID, and I don't think the Commission would say it is just COVID. As soon as you start introducing complex discussions between different people, and I think it'd be worth coming on to the issues the Brigade faced in terms of the high-rise firefighting policy, which is sort of evidence actually the Brigade can only do so much themselves. Some of these issues require national solutions, and I think that's one of the big challenges. But I'm confident that the Brigade is talking to all relevant stakeholders, and actually I know that the government and the Home Office share the share the view that they are part of the solution as well. And I think we have to work cross-party and cross-organisation to make sure things progress. But this isn't something that people are sitting back and going, oh, we've done 2/3 of them, we're making good progress. This is something that on a daily basis, the Commission and his staff are chasing up progress on and working with stakeholders externally, so the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Home Office in particular, but also the Fire Brigade Union, in terms of making sure that things really do get driven through and change is as fast and as effective as possible. But what I would say is one of the lessons we've learned from the last few years is that you have to have lasting change. So these policies and the practices have to stick, and that will be the real test. Is if Ali Hay comes back in 2 years' time and says, yes, they're still doing what they demonstrated they were doing 2 years ago when the policy was fresh, things have really changed and moved on, and ultimately the real prize in all this is the safety of Londoners. And so I think that people are really mindful of that is why we are doing it. It's to make sure that London is as safe as it can be, and Londoners is kept as safe by the Brigade as they can be as well.
Thank you. I'm going to come to the Fire Commissioner, and I can just about say good morning, we're just coming up to noon. And I'm going to ask you about breathing apparatus, and I'm going to ask you about the PN 623 and the changes to the high-rise firefighting policy in a minute. But I just want to start first of all with I think it's the airwave communication link. And the Brigade has been looking at the use of this direct communication link between the control room, which obviously came in for a lot of comment in the Grenfell Tower Inquiry Report 1, and the bridgehead on the fire ground. And I just wondered, are we on track for implementing that? It's due to be implemented July, August, September. Is that definitely going to be coming in by September 21? And what's involved in that? And is it all going to happen on time?
It is, and actually, in fact, it's further ahead than that, because that's what you saw in reality. It goes back to the Deputy Mayor's point about change only being worth doing if it's manifesting an improved service to our communities. So that's exactly what you saw at the New Providence Wall fire. We had people on the bridgehead of what was an extremely challenging fire talking directly with a dedicated link on airwave back into control, closing the loop of information, enabling firefighters to carry out 35 rescues of people who were trapped across 18 flats at that point. So extremely dynamic, but putting that into operation. And it's actually only around the kind of continued formal implementation of it that gives us that end point. We've seen it work in reality. I'm very confident that work will be formally completed within those timescales.
Yeah, I think that link up with the control room, as well as
something that I think we discussed in the last meeting, which was the use of drones so that people have actually got better view on the fire ground from the bridgehead as to exactly what is going on should we end up in a situation with another one of these complicated and very large fires. So I think the two together will be particularly useful. One of the other areas that was really covered a lot in all the reports, Her Majesty's inspectors, but following on, but also from the Grenfell Tower Inquiry report number 1, was about the development of policies, particularly around training, and a lot about the introduction of new breathing apparatus. Now, I think Richard Mills has just written to Chair to update on the introduction of the hoods and the fact that they've now been used in 45 incidents. But I wondered if you could also tell us about introducing changing the way that the breathing apparatus is deployed, because it's not just the hoods, is it, which I think are used for helping people escape. It's the breathing apparatus for the firefighters as well.
Yeah, I think it's wider than that. We've taken a fundamentally changed approach, and we've led the National Fire Service in doing this, by the way. So we have brought forward 3 entirely new policies in respect to high-rise firefighting, the evacuation of blocks, and I say evacuation, at that point it's an emergency evacuation. It's a very difficult and dynamic exercise to undertake. So the evacuation of blocks that are beginning to fail, and the processing and use of fire survival guidance data. So therefore the information that's coming from people trapped inside the building, and how we then dedicate particularly our breathing apparatus resources to meet the most serious kind of risk within the compass of that incident. All of those policies are now published, implemented, in force. Our entire workforce has been trained, and the best answer as to whether or not they're effective was shown at New Providence Wharf, because those 3 policies were enacted in full with a completely different approach to the deployment of breathing apparatus, the evacuation of a block at the earliest point of that incident, the coordination between the bridgehead control and the incident command team to ensure that fire survival guidance information was captured and used appropriately to task those resources. And that's what resulted in those 35 rescues, 22 using fire escape hoods, and ensuring that despite 2 members of the public and 1 firefighter being injured, we didn't see the sort of tragedy we did encounter at Grenfell.
No, I mean, I think there's nobody in the room who would have particularly wished to see a demonstration of the impact of the new arrangements, but in one sense New Providence Wharf has provided that, which you've just alluded to, and I think we're all extremely thankful that the Brigade has moved ahead with that, and I'm particularly pleased to hear that everybody has been trained on the new arrangements, the new breathing apparatus, the new ways of operating, the new firefighting at height. And that applies to everybody who are coming back from deployments elsewhere, because we've had a lot of people who've been deployed onto PMART and helping with pandemic tasks.
Yes, so that there's a full catch-up programme. This is, again, and it speaks to a wider point about the maintenance and embedding of change. So we are certain that we need to maintain this change moving forward. So there's a very well-developed kind of catch-up training plan and onward maintenance of those skills and underpinning knowledge that's required to enact those policies.
Thank you. I mean, I've always been impressed whenever I've visited fire stations at the checklists and the amount of training that goes on continuously. So it's really good to hear that these changes are being incorporated in that way. And that was one of the points actually in the letter to the Chair from Richard Mills, that he said that PN 623 has now been fully implemented, the high-rise firefighting policy, and it was very welcome to hear that that took place in June 2021, which of course is the anniversary month of when the Grenfell tragedy took place. How is that? How are people finding it? Obviously, it's been sadly useful in New Providence Wharf, Road, but you know, is that something now that people are embracing across the brigade? It's just becoming a natural part.
Considerable feedback from the junior officers and crews that, of course, have all been trained, that they welcome it, they recognise it's a set of policies that give them the tools to fight fires in those buildings that represent the greatest risk to the residents that live within them. So yeah, the feedback from operational staff has been overwhelmingly positive.
And obviously, that was something that may include some potential spending requirements for the brigade that's flowing from these changes. Are there spending implications? How much is likely to be involved, if so, and where will any additional funding come from?
So I'd have to write to you with the detail of that, but as a general point, change costs. And we've got a change management, a transformation management process in place, which is actually chaired by my colleague who's here today, Fiona Dolman. So Fiona, would you perhaps like to explain to the committee member how we both understand and manage the costs of transformation generally?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Probably sounds like a long time in the meeting to say that, but it's my first opportunity, so thank you. We've set up a brigade portfolio board because we have quite a large portfolio of change that we are seeking to manage, as you can see by the range of recommendations across the organisation. We have a transformation reserve, which is a fund of around 7 million. What we've been doing is working with our colleagues across LFB to allocate that reserve to the programmes of work that will have the best impact. So we manage that through an investment process. We have a set of triage criteria, a normal kind of approach that you would take to assessing investment proposals. And that's a shift for the fire brigades. That's a relatively new thing that we're doing. And as proposals are coming through, we're assessing them against that criteria to make sure that the benefits are understood and that the value for money will be achieved by making that investment. So that's the approach that we take.
Thank you. Commissioner, can I just come back to you on the implementation of the multi-agency information transfer protocol? What are the implications for the brigade? And could you give us an update on implementation?
That offers a technological solution that ensures from the earliest point in an incident, different emergency service control rooms are working together. It's a national piece of work, but again, we are leading on this in terms of offering ourselves up as one of the first services to take it on. But we are somewhat governed by the ability of national colleagues to bring that piece of work to completion through. I think it's a really good piece of work and we fully embrace it. And we are leading as one of the primary services across the emergency services in the UK to take that technology on and embed that system at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you. And I do hope that does move ahead, because I think it will be very useful, obviously not just in London but elsewhere in the country. The Transformation Delivery Plan included a commitment to review all the existing training programmes, materials and facilities. Has this work been completed, and what are the findings? And is that one for you, Commissioner, or should I go back to Fiona for that?
I think that's probably me, and the simple answer is it's underway at the moment. So a full review of training and training assurance is currently underway. We brought in new leadership into training. We now have a dedicated assistant commissioner sitting alongside a professional head of training that are leading on that work, and we would expect to bring the results of that review to this committee, and I would welcome that opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Zaik-Polansky.
Thank you. The final section, Commissioner, is for you on inspection.
No, sorry, you said you were coming in on the back.
No.
You're not. I've just got a couple, and then you can do your final.
No problem at all.
Sorry, I thought you were coming
overexcited.
on the back of that. Commissioner, you talk about policies being implemented. Does that include working above the bridgehead with BA not under air?
Currently, London firefighters are not working above the bridgehead, not under air, but that is now a matter for national discussion with both government, the Health and Safety Executive and the Fire Brigades Union to seek resolution to what is, to be fair, a very difficult operational issue with valid perspectives on either side of the argument.
When do you expect that to be resolved?
I can give you an answer on that, Chair. It's intractable in some ways. We've been trying to find a solution to this over the past 2+ years. It speaks to the very real nature of the risk in the built environment that firefighters face. But what we do have is a schedule of meetings, again, led by the Brigade in terms of seeking an answer to this incredibly difficult problem, diarised in with the Health and Safety Executive, the Fire Brigades Union and colleagues from the Home Office. The initial meetings have already occurred. There's been useful discussion, and I will, again, of course, look forward to updating this committee as they unfold.
I think I've been asking questions about this. It must be for nearly 2 years now. It really has got to be progressed, hasn't it?
Yes, I would
Yes.
agree with you, Chair.
Right, okay, so it's the unions that are stopping that, basically. Can you just confirm whether this is right? I've been told that within the last week, delegates were on a blue light revalidation course for both senior officers and fire engine drivers, so there was about 10 of them. They all subsequently passed the course. However, it was then discovered that Babcock's instructor's own blue light qualification had expired. Those people had been driving around the capital and the home countries at a speed on blue lights and unqualified, and it now means that they've gone back to normal driving duties. Is that correct?
That's the first time I've heard that information, Chair. If that's the case, that's wholly unacceptable, and we will provide you, obviously, with a clear written response to that question.
Please do, and if it is correct, perhaps you'll tell us what you're going to do about that, because that is totally unacceptable. Great, okay, thanks. We're on to the last stage now. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. For the last stage, inspections and audits. Commissioner, the number of fire safety audits and inspections carried out by the Brigade dropped in 2020. With the relaxation of COVID-19 restrictions, is this likely to now increase?
Yes, is the short answer. I would expect it to. I think we have to, in the context of everything we've talked about in the built environment, it has to. Both our advice to communities and our regulatory inspection advice will need to increase, both in terms of number and focus on the highest risk premises.
Thank you. And can I check what proportion of audits are currently carried out virtually? And do you envisage desktop audits to continue at all once the restrictions have eased?
Perhaps if I could pass to Paul Jennings to answer that, because he'll have the detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Last year we carried out 637 desktop audits, and that was from a total of 8,604. We were one of the few brigades that carried on with face-to-face audits last year and commended by the HMI Inspectorate for that. Desktop audits will continue. There is a place for them. We see them as a process of triage in a similar way to the online home fire safety checker. It will enable inspecting officers to undertake desktop approach and then complete more audits in that way, so they can target the high-risk ones from that.
Thank you very much. Returning to you, Commissioner, the Brigade has said that it will monitor the drop in enforcement numbers to determine if this is related to pandemic or reflective of an improved approach to fire safety overall. Has this work been carried out, and what do the results suggest?
Again, Paul, if I could perhaps turn to you for the detail on that.
Thank you. We've seen a drop. I think it's a 5% drop on the previous year of enforcement notices and notices of deficiencies. We believe that's due to the different premises we're now going in. We've targeted over the last year high-rise premises rather than what traditionally we went to in terms of shops and dwellings, commercial premises, which obviously a large number have been shut during COVID. I think with the relaxing of COVID restrictions and seeing different business types open up, we'll see an increase in those enforcement notices, because traditionally a certain building type we saw that's where the enforcement notices took place.
Makes sense, thank you. And finally, Commissioner, what progress has been made in recruitment and retaining of inspecting officers and fire safety advisors, including work with the Fire Brigade Union, and when does the Brigade expect to be at full establishment?
So I'm going to make a general point and then bring Paul in. What I'd like to say is recognise Paul's efforts and his leadership inside fire safety in taking a completely refreshed approach to this, which I think has driven our numbers up admirably in what is an extremely competitive market for those individuals. So Paul, perhaps if you could lay out the detail of that again for our colleague on the committee.
Of course, thank you, Commissioner. In the last year, we've recruited 40 fire safety advisors. That's more than we've recruited firefighters because of the recruitment freeze. We're seeing a really large take-up in terms of that recruitment. We plan to run further cohorts throughout the year. We've now set up a second training centre to take in those fire safety inspectors. But we're also looking at appealing to firefighters and control officers to actually appeal to existing staff to come over and join us in that inspection regime. And so we're looking at new shift systems in discussion with the FBU to enable that to happen. And one area that's been really beneficial and really proud of is that we've used some of the government grant funding to offer a level 3 introduction to fire safety course to our operational and control staff, and we had over 300 volunteers from those staff to undertake that course. And so those courses have started, and we anticipate they will complete in the next year, and if successful I can see that being rolled out to further operational staff. And that to me is the hook then, that when we take staff in, they're already part qualified, and that will actually give us over double the amount of qualified fire safety staff within the organisation. So very good green shoots, I would say. We're moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just ask, has the FBU been constructive over training of staff to carry out the audit inspections?
Yes, we're having a very good dialogue with that in terms of fire safety checks. That's ongoing, but we're seeing that groundswell of staff wanting to volunteer to actually undertake fire safety work, which is really beneficial.
It's good, because there was a point when firefighters were less keen to do that, far more keen to put out fires, which is what they signed up for, the older ones anyway, in the first place. Well, my reputation is intact. We are finishing on time, so thank you, everybody. Then I thank you to our guests for your contributions today. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group league members to agree any output from the discussion? Agreed? Thank you. Can we note the committee work programme and meeting dates as agreed by the London Assembly at its annual meeting on the 14th of May 2021? And can we also note the additional activity undertaken, namely the informal meeting with Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary, I can never say that, and Fire and Rescue Services? Excellent, thank you. The date of the next meeting of the committee will be confirmed by the London Assembly in due course. I have no other urgent business, so I therefore declare this meeting to be closed. Thank you.